Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin, too, by thanking you and your staff for your commitment to having another on-time budget that does not raise taxes and lives within its means. And I think it's important that today we are looking at the expense side of the budget. Pennsylvania, on its expense side of the budget, has some pretty deep-rooted, long fiscal problems. And the two solutions that the minority party offer here today is they offer higher taxes and they want a larger dependence on an Obama White House through the expansion of Medicaid. Both ideas are only a cover-up to our structural fiscal problems, problems that must be solved if we're going to have fiscal viability going forward. Problems like pension crisis, school district administration costs, and school boards that refuse to consolidate operational expenses in a serious manner. School districts that continue to stockpile dollars in their reserve balances. But the minority party's idea of higher taxes and a larger reliance on Washington, in my opinion, will only hinder our economic growth and set us up for even larger holes in the future. As the chairman mentioned, our budget shortfalls this year has a lot to do with the policies and the decisions made in Washington, the policies of raising taxes, the implementation of Obamacare that has skyrocketed health care costs and has sucked up a tremendous amount of capital that our private sector could be using to invest in higher wages. When we look at income growth over the last 12 months, it's half of what was projected. And Mr. Chairman, I'm thankful for your commitment to higher education and flat funding higher education. But going forward, we have to, in my opinion, do an even better job of raising expectations where taxpayer dollars are being spent. Just recently in a hearing, we heard that 58% of students that go to college don't finish. 58% of kids in Pennsylvania that go to college don't get a degree. The idea that just throwing more and more dollars at it while 50 cents on every dollar does not get to our goal, I think is maddening. As the chairman mentioned, this is a budget that is focused on the expense side of the ledger, but clearly we need to look at the revenue side. And far too often politicians look towards revenue to balance the government's checkbook when there's insufficient funds. But let me be clear, there is no magic bullet. There is no revenue source large enough to solve Harrisburg's spending appetite. If there was, we simply would wreck the economy. Let me be clear, too, Mr. Chairman, that Pennsylvania already has the 10th highest tax burden in the country. So the notion that our general fund or our county governments or our school district don't have enough dollars to spend is off base. We are the 10th highest taxing state in the country already. And the emotional debate is education. It's the elephant in the room, and the $1 billion myth, the $1 billion cut myth keeps getting repeated. So if I could just provide some reality over some of the campaign year rhetoric that we've heard, the last 2 years of Rendell's spending on education, state investments, $9.2 billion, $8.8 billion. We went from $8.8 billion in the last year of Governor Rendell to the first year of Governor Corbett, and you as becoming the majority chairman, Mr. Chairman, we went from $8.8 billion state investment to $9.3 billion, to $9.7. To this current fiscal year, we're at $9.9, and for the first time in Pennsylvania's history, we're looking at a $10 billion investment in education. But how do we stack up against the other 49 states? Where does that put us? Because we've heard clearly that somebody said our schools are deteriorating. Mr. Chairman, we rank in the top 10% in the country in per pupil spend. On average, Pennsylvania spends $14,956 per student, 25% higher than the national average. We hear continued cries that we need more and more funding. We've heard stories of teachers that have to go into their own dollars, their own personal dollars, to put pencils and paper on the desks of their students. But last year, school districts added $445 million to the reserve fund. In 2012, they added $350 million to their reserve fund. Since Governor Corbett took office, school districts have put $1.16 billion in their reserve funds. Meanwhile, we hear the minority chairman say that our schools are deteriorating, but they're stockpiling money under the mattress, and we haven't heard from them of why they are saving this money for a rainy day when they continue to say it's storming. Until we address, or until school boards address, that we have 500 superintendents, 500 business managers, many making near or more than the governor himself, they are not serious about funding education adequately. School boards must stop laying off teachers before they consolidate administrations. What we need is increased investments for classrooms. So let's look over the last 15 years. We'll see that school boards have increased spending on central office support in the last 15 years by 306%. Debt payment has went up 171%, but classroom spending in the last 15 years has only went up 81%. Mr. Chairman, let's look at who the school boards are hiring over the last 14 years. Administration hiring since 2000 has went up 40%. The support staff for those administrators by 18%, but teachers have only went up 14%. Students in classrooms and teachers should be our number 1, 2, and 3 priority, not debt, administration. Adding 17,000 staff members since 2000, while we lost 60,000 students, is reckless decision-making. As they've lost customers, they've hired more employees. And over the last decade, pension and health care costs, as we know, have skyrocketed. Mr. Chairman, the pension crisis has been well documented. But unfortunately, we've got union leadership that is here in Harrisburg running through the hallways saying, just fund it. There's no crisis, just fund it. It's the fastest growing line item in the budget, Mr. Chairman. We can protect retired and current workers' benefits and still make a generous yet realistic agreement to future hires in a similar way to the private sector. The previous gentleman said once again, except for pensions as it relates to education spending. Mr. Chairman, it would be irresponsible for us to think that education dollars in the benefit packages for those employees is not part of the education spending. And really briefly, I'd like to just talk about the fact that the natural gas industry continues to be an idea for the other side of the aisle to save our spending addictions and to save our spending in priorities. The direct jobs, Mr. Chairman, I thought you did a great job talking about how unemployment has gone down to 5.6%. The national average is at 6.3%. It wasn't that long ago that the minority party was the party saying that we were above the national average, yet today they don't want to talk about how we're almost 0.75% below the national average. The indirect jobs associated with the natural gas industry of the steel workers, United States shipyards, the Acre Company in Philly that has tripled employment, quadrupled share prices, has almost $1 billion of backlog of orders because of the demand for tankers. They don't want to talk about the indirect jobs that were saved because of your efforts, Mr. Chairman, the governor's efforts to reopen those refineries in Delaware County, saving 15,000 jobs. And I know they continue to say, Mr. Chairman, that gas isn't going anywhere. It's going to be here. Well, Mr. Chairman, in fairness, gas below the surface, in my opinion, is useless. Gas at the surface without an end user is almost useless. Our real potential lies on allowing a market for natural gas users to stay here in Pennsylvania and to come here from other areas. A severance tax, in my opinion, sets us back and we lose our competitive advantage. But that side of the aisle wants to talk about, I think the last gentleman said, a reasonable severance tax. Well, leading the nation in another tax is not reasonable. No plan that gentleman has supported when it relates to severance tax has been reasonable. He says $700 million if we just put in a reasonable tax. Mr. Chairman, these budgets that we work on and we pass, they're not balanced by rates. They're balanced by revenue. So let's look at West Virginia's 5% severance tax revenue. In the last 3 years, they've made $202 million off their 5% severance tax. With a reasonable impact fee, Pennsylvania has brought in $630 million for its constituents in its areas being affected. And while the other side of the aisle wants to talk about revenue and the fact that we need revenue, our local governments, our state, have made additional revenues for the taxpayers by partnering on county-owned or municipal-owned or state-owned land to have upfront lease payments. The Democratic executive of Allegheny County has brought in almost $500 million for the taxpayers of Allegheny County. And when the governor talked about encouraging responsible leasing on our state land that doesn't affect the surface, which would have brought in tens of millions of dollars, the same folks that are demanding more revenue were opposed to that plan. The same caucus that overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, I believe, voted against getting out of the liquor business. I think somebody had mentioned the conflict of interest associated with the DCNR being paid by leasing of that land. But when I looked at the conflict of interest of the LCB getting paid for the sale of liquor, and it's also the enforcement agency that is encouraging more sales and a higher volume of sales, yet they're enforcing it and getting paid for those dollars, that was not a conflict of interest from the other side of the aisle. I think this plan gets us to another on-time budget that doesn't raise taxes, that lives within its means, and it prioritizes in the most responsible way possible. And I congratulate you, Mr. Chairman, and your staff. Thank you.